All right, so ready to dive into some kind of unexpected territory today.
Let's do it. Always up for a challenge.
Perfect, because we're tackling, get this, the art world, but like not your usual art chat.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
We're going deep on the Museum of Modern Art MoMA, their collection specifically. But the real meat here is gender representation, or how little there actually was for a long time. We've got some data on the Museum of Modern Art's collection. You know, MoMA.
Yeah, one of the big ones.
Exactly. And we're going to see what it says about gender representation in their collection over time.
Okay, so we're like looking beyond the art itself and into the numbers.
Kind of, yeah. It's one thing to wander those halls, but digging into the data, well, it tells a whole different story sometimes, you know?
Absolutely, because museums, they're like these big cultural time capsules. And analyzing that data can really expose these hidden patterns, even imbalances you might not see at first glance.
Exactly. So let's set the stage a little. We're working with data on almost 160,000 works.
Wow. Okay, so we're not talking small scale here.
Nope. From over 27,000 artists.
That's a big chunk of art history.
Huge. And remember, we're looking at the number of artists represented here, not just individual artworks, right?
Right, which is important, yeah, because that tells us something about whose voices are being recognized, like whose careers are actually being impacted, not just how many pieces ended up on a museum wall.
Exactly. And when you look at it that way, well, the data reveals a pretty shocking imbalance. Like in the 1960s, less than 5% of MoMA's acquisitions were works by women artists.
Wow, 5%?
Yeah, and even by the 1980s, that number had only risen to about 10%. It makes you think about all the talent that might have been overlooked, all the artists who never really got a shot.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought for sure. And it's not just MoMA, sadly. This trend, it's like a pattern you see throughout art history. Women artists have had to face all these extra hurdles, getting into art school, getting their work seen, getting into these big collections.
Right, it's like they were forced to start the race way behind everyone else. And the source we've been looking at, they highlight the period from the 1950s to the 2000s as especially imbalanced.
Well, yeah. Think about those decades. Societally, women were often shut out of artistic spaces. Less funding, fewer mentors, barely any gallery representation. It wasn't just about the art. It was the whole system.
It's true. Like even just picturing like the classic image of a struggling artist, right?
Right.
It's almost always a man. It's so ingrained in how we think about art.
Totally, yeah.
But the data does show a little improvement, but like a little narrowing of the gap from the 1990s on.
Right. And it's interesting, right, because that's also when you see feminist art movements really gaining traction. So was MoMA reacting to external pressure, or were they making a conscious effort to diversify? It's hard to say for sure, but it's a question worth asking.
Yeah, because there was also this broader cultural shift going on, right? Like more focus on diversity and inclusion.
Absolutely. And museums, they were becoming more aware of their own biases.
Okay, so a tiny bit of progress, even if it's crazy how slow it's been.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, with all this data, it's a starting point.
Right, it doesn't tell the whole story.
Yeah, exactly. Like we see the artists' genders, but what don't we know?
Like tons, right?
Yeah. We don't know the specific types of art being acquired in different periods, the artists' backgrounds, beyond just gender, even how prominently the works by women were displayed within the museum itself. Was it hidden in a back corner or front and center?
It's like you really start to think about those human stories behind the numbers, you know?
Totally. Like next time you're in an art museum, any museum, ask yourself, whose voices am I hearing? And whose am I missing? Data like this helps us see those imbalances, start asking the critical questions, and hopefully make some actual change.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that there's always more to uncover, more to question, more to fight for when it comes to representation.
Couldn't agree more.
And we actually have some fascinating data visualizations to help us unpack this. It's not just about the art itself, but the whole system, you know?
Yeah, let's jump into it. Right off the bat, this visualization charting MoMA's acquisitions by gender paints a pretty stark picture.
Oh, yeah.
In the 1960s, we see this massive gap. Like, it's a mountain of male artists compared to, like, a tiny hill of women. What is going on there?
It's pretty stark, yeah. It really reflects a much bigger trend in the art world at the time. Research shows that back then, less than 5%, think about that, less than 5% of the works held in major permanent collections in the U.S. were by women artists.
Wow. Less than 5%.
Yeah.
So we're talking, what, less than 1 in 20?
Exactly. So we have to ask ourselves, what was happening in the 1960s that could explain this huge disparity?
Okay, so 1960s. I mean, that's when abstract expressionism was having its moment, right? Like
Right.
Pollock, Rothko, those guys.
Totally. Now, that's not to say there weren't amazing women artists working then, too. Lee Krasner, Helen Frankenthaler, and tons more. But for women artists to break into those established, those really powerful circles, those big galleries, that was a whole other hurdle.
Because it wasn't just about the art itself, it was about access.
Yeah.
Like, if you're a woman artist in the 1960s, are you getting the same gallery representation? Are critics paying attention?
Exactly. And if your art's not being shown in the right galleries, if it's not being championed by important critics, then it's much less likely that MoMA's even going to know you exist, let alone want to acquire your work.
Right. It makes you realize how much influence all those gatekeepers had. So, okay, we've got this huge gap in the 60s. But then, as we move forward in time with this visualization, things start to change.
Yeah.
We see the lines, they begin to converge, and the gap starts to shrink, especially as we get closer to today.
Totally. And this is where it gets really interesting. This shift happens around the same time as the rise of feminist art movements in the 70s and 80s. These movements were directly challenging a lot of those structures we were just talking about that made it so hard for women artists to gain recognition.
So it's not just that women artists suddenly started creating more art. It's that the whole way the world was looking at art, looking at women artists, was shifting.
100%. And, museums like MoMA, they definitely felt that pressure to diversify their collections, to be more representative of all the incredible art being made by women, to better reflect the world outside their doors.
Okay, so that brings us to, well, now, today, the gap in acquisitions between male and female artists is still there, but it's definitely getting smaller. What does that tell us about where we are now and where we might be headed in the future?
It's progress for sure, but I think it's important to ask ourselves, is it happening fast enough? Is it real systemic change, or are we just kind of playing catch up at this point? And I think it's really on all of us, not just institutions like museums, to be seeking out, to be championing a much wider, more diverse range of artistic voices, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? This whole conversation just makes you think. If this data is only showing us the artists who did get collected by a museum like MoMA, what about the incredible art by women that hasn't been seen, that hasn't had the chance to be celebrated in the same way? That's something I'd really love to dig into more in the future.
So as we wrap up here, thinking about MoMA and this gender gap, it's a good reminder for all museums, really. How do we get to true equality in these collections? And what will that mean for how people understand art in the future? Big questions, folks. Big questions. Thanks for diving into this data with me.
Of course. Always a pleasure to talk art with you.
And to all of you listening, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time.